My name is Alma, and I'm 62 years old. As I sit here in my quiet kitchen tonight, staring at Robert's empty chair across from me, I never imagined that the deepest pain wouldn't come from losing my husband of 38 years to that sudden heart attack last week. No, the wound that cuts deepest came from my own son Marcus just 3 hours after we laid his father to rest. What happened at that funeral home changed everything I thought I knew about family loyalty and the son I raised with so much love. But sometimes when someone shows you who they really are, you have to believe them the first time. And sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who hurt us deepest. Before I share this story with you, please let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that remind us we're not alone in our struggles. And now let me take you back to that devastating day that changed my life forever. Robert and I met in the university library when I was 23, both of us reaching for the same accounting textbook. He was studying to become a certified public accountant, and I was working on my elementary education degree. We talked for hours that first day, and I knew I'd found my person. We married 8 months later in a small ceremony at my family's church in Ohio. Those early years were magical. Robert worked long hours building his accounting practice, while I taught third grade at Lincoln Elementary School. When Marcus came along 3 years later, I made the decision to stay home and focus on raising our son. Marcus was a bright child, always curious about numbers just like his father. But even from an early age, I noticed he had a distant quality about him. While other children would run to their mothers when they got hurt, Marcus would seek out Robert. When I tried to read bedtime stories, he'd ask for Daddy instead. I told myself it was just a phase that boys naturally gravitate toward their fathers. Robert would reassure me, saying, "Marcus loved me just as much, he just showed it differently." But deep down, I always felt like I was chasing my son's affection, never quite earning the same place in his heart that Robert held. As Marcus grew older, the distance only widened. He excelled in school, particularly in mathematics and business courses, but he rarely shared his achievements with me first. It was always Daddy he ran to with good news. When he graduated valedictorian from high school, I was so proud, but when I tried to hug him at the ceremony, he stiffened in my arms. That night, I cried myself to sleep, wondering what I'd done wrong as a mother. College took Marcus even further away from us both, physically and emotionally. He chose a prestigious university in New York to study finance, claiming he wanted to experience life in the big city. Our phone calls became brief and infrequent. When I'd call to check on him, he'd always seem rushed, eager to end the conversation. Robert would take the phone and they'd talk for another 20 minutes about stocks, business opportunities, and Marcus's career prospects. I felt like an outsider in my own family. The real turning point came when Marcus met Sarah during his final year of college. She was a law student from a wealthy Connecticut family, brilliant and ambitious with plans to work for a major corporate law firm. From the moment I met her at Marcus's graduation, I could sense her judgment. She looked at our modest home, my simple clothes, and my small-town mannerisms with barely concealed disdain. When I mentioned how proud I was of my vegetable garden, she made a comment about how quaint it was that some people still found fulfillment in such simple pursuits. After graduation, Marcus moved to Chicago for his job at a financial consulting firm, and Sarah landed a position at a prestigious law firm in the same city. Their visits home became even more rare, usually limited to major holidays, and even then, they'd stay for the shortest time possible. Sarah would sit stiffly at our dinner table, checking her phone constantly, making it clear she had better places to be. She'd make subtle comments about our furniture being vintage in a way that clearly meant outdated or suggest that we should downsize now that we were getting older. The last normal conversation I had with Marcus was about 2 years ago when Robert was diagnosed with his first minor heart episode. I called Marcus frightened and needing support, and he actually seemed concerned. He asked about the medical details, the doctor's recommendations, and even offered to fly home if we needed him. For a moment, I felt like I had my son back. But when he did visit that weekend, Sarah came with him, and she spent the entire time suggesting we look into assisted living facilities for our own safety. The warmth I'd felt from Marcus quickly disappeared as he began nodding along with her suggestions. Robert's health improved with medication and lifestyle changes, and life returned to a new normal. But I noticed Robert seemed more thoughtful. more introspective. He'd spend time in his study in the evenings working on what he called important paperwork. When I'd ask about it, he'd just smile and say he was making sure everything was in order for our future. I assumed he was referring to retirement planning or updating our insurance policies. Then came that terrible Thursday morning 6 weeks ago. I was watering my tomato plants when Mrs. Peterson from next door came running over, her face pale with worry. The hospital had called her when they couldn't reach me because Robert had listed her as an emergency contact years ago when I had surgery. Robert had collapsed at his office during a meeting with clients. By the time the ambulance arrived and got him to the hospital, it was too late. The massive heart attack had taken him instantly. I called Marcus immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed. Sarah answered his phone, her voice cold and efficient. She said Marcus was in an important meeting and couldn't be disturbed, but she'd give him the message. It was 3 hours before Marcus called me back. When I told him his father was gone, there was a long silence. Then he said, "I'll make arrangements to fly out for the funeral. Sarah can't get away from work right now." No words of comfort for me, no shared grief, just logistics. That's when I should have known what was coming. The morning of Robert's funeral arrived gray and drizzly, matching the heaviness in my heart. I'd been awake since 5 o'clock, unable to sleep, moving through the house like a ghost. Everything reminded me of Robert. His coffee mug still sat in the sink from Tuesday morning, the last day of our life together. His reading glasses were folded on the kitchen counter next to yesterday's newspaper, still open to the business section he never got to finish. I spent those early morning hours preparing food for the reception afterward. It's what women in my family had always done during times of grief. We cooked. I made Robert's favorite chocolate cake, the one I'd surprised him with, every birthday for 38 years. I prepared sandwiches, cut vegetables, and arranged everything on the good china we'd received as wedding gifts, but rarely used. Keeping busy helped me avoid thinking about the impossible reality that Robert was truly gone. Marcus arrived just as I was getting dressed in my black wool dress, the one Robert had complimented me on the last time I wore it to his company Christmas party 2 years ago. I heard his rental car pull into the driveway, and for a moment, my heart lifted. Finally, my son was home during one of the most difficult times of my life. Surely grief would bring us together the way joy never had. But when Marcus walked through the front door, he looked like a stranger. His expensive black suit probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. His hair was perfectly styled, and he carried himself with the confident bearing of a successful businessman. But his eyes were cold, distant, as if he was attending the funeral of an acquaintance rather than his own father. "Hello, Mother," he said formally, giving me a brief, uncomfortable hug. It felt like embracing a mannequin. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Your loss, not our loss." As if Robert's death was something that had happened to me alone, rather than a tragedy that had shattered both of our worlds. During the funeral service at St. Matthew's Methodist Church, Marcus sat beside me in the front pew, but he might as well have been on another planet. Pastor Williams delivered a beautiful eulogy about Robert's integrity, his devotion to family, and his quiet acts of service in the community. Several of Robert's longtime clients spoke about his honesty and reliability. Our neighbor, Mr. Henderson, shared a funny story about how Robert had helped him learn to use email so he could stay in touch with his grandchildren. Throughout the entire service, Marcus sat rigidly checking his phone whenever he thought no one was looking. I could see him typing messages, probably responding to work emails or texting Sarah with updates. When the congregation sang Robert's favorite hymn, "How Great Thou Art," I noticed Marcus wasn't even pretending to sing along. He just sat there looking irritated, as if the whole proceeding was an inconvenience he had to endure. After the service, as we made our way to the cemetery, I tried to take Marcus's arm for support. He allowed it, but I could feel the tension in his body, the way he held himself apart from me, even while walking beside me. At the graveside, as Pastor Williams spoke the final words and we watched Robert's casket being lowered into the ground, I finally broke down. 38 years of marriage, of shared dreams and quiet moments were ending with this terrible finality. I reached for Marcus's hand, needing some human connection, some shared acknowledgement of our loss. He allowed me to hold his hand for perhaps 10 seconds before gently pulling away and checking his phone again. That's when I noticed he was texting someone named S, with messages like, "Almost done here," and "We'll call you tonight." Sarah, of course. Even at his father's graveside, Marcus was more connected to his wife than to his grieving mother. The reception at our church fellowship hall passed in a blur of casseroles, condolences, and memories shared by people who had truly loved Robert. Mrs. Peterson stayed close to me, making sure I ate something and helping me navigate conversations when grief made it hard to think clearly. Pastor Williams pulled me aside to tell me about a conversation he'd had with Robert just 2 months ago, where my husband had spoken about how proud he was of the life we'd built together. "Robert talked about you all the time, Alma," Pastor Williams said, his weathered hand warm on my shoulder. "He said you were the strongest woman he'd ever known, and that he couldn't have built his business or his life without you. He was so grateful for the sacrifices you made, especially giving up your teaching career to raise Marcus and support his dreams." Those words should have comforted me, but instead they made me even sadder. If Robert had felt that way, why couldn't Marcus see it? Why couldn't my own son understand the value of the life I'd chosen, the love I'd poured into our family? As the reception wound down and people began to leave, I found myself standing alone in the fellowship hall, surrounded by empty plates and the lingering scent of flowers. Marcus appeared beside me, still checking his phone, and said, "I need to talk to you about Dad's affairs tomorrow. There are legal matters we need to discuss." Again, no warmth, no acknowledgement of what we'd just been through together. Just business. That night, as I lay in the bed I'd shared with Robert for so many years staring at his empty pillow, I tried to tell myself that Marcus was just processing grief differently than I was. Some people shut down emotionally when faced with loss. Some people throw themselves into practical matters to avoid feeling the pain. But deep down I knew this was something else. This was the culmination of years of growing distance of my son seeing me as less important, less valuable than the other people in his life. And tomorrow, I was about to find out just how little he thought of me. The next evening, Marcus arrived at the house without calling first. I heard his car in the driveway around 7 o'clock and felt a flutter of hope. Maybe he'd come to check on me to finally have the heart-to-heart conversation we'd never quite managed to have. Maybe grief would crack open that wall he'd built around his emotions and let me see the little boy who used to build block towers in our living room. When I opened the front door, Marcus walked past me without making eye contact, carrying a leather briefcase and a manila folder thick with papers. He was still wearing that expensive suit, though he'd loosened his tie slightly. Everything about his posture and expression suggested this was a business meeting, not a son visiting his recently widowed mother. "We need to discuss Dad's will and the estate," Marcus announced, settling himself at our kitchen table as if he owned the place. He spread papers across the same table where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals, where we'd helped Marcus with homework, where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays and all the ordinary moments that make up a life together. "Marcus, honey, can't this wait a few days?" I asked, still hoping to find some gentleness in my son. "We just buried your father yesterday. I'm not really ready to think about legal matters yet." "Mother, these things can't wait," Marcus replied impatiently. "There are tax implications, asset transfers, and a lot of complicated financial matters that need to be handled properly. Sarah has been researching the legal requirements, and she says it's important to move quickly." Sarah again. Always Sarah. It seemed like every major decision in Marcus's life now came with her influence attached to it. I sat down across from him, folding my hands in my lap the way I used to when he was young and I was trying to have a serious conversation with him about his behavior. "Your father left a will, sweetheart. Mr. Davidson, our lawyer, explained everything to me. The house stays with me along with most of our savings and assets. You inherit your father's business equipment, his files, and a portion of our savings account. It's all very straightforward." Marcus's face darkened. "That's exactly the problem, Mother. This distribution doesn't make any sense from a financial standpoint. You're 62 years old with no career, no earning potential, and no real understanding of money management. Meanwhile, I have a finance degree, years of professional experience, and the ability to invest and grow these assets properly." I felt like he'd slapped me. "Marcus, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that Dad's will was written from emotion, not logic. You don't deserve to inherit the majority of assets when you didn't contribute to earning them. You've been a housewife for 35 years, Mother. You haven't worked a real job since before I was born. Dad supported you financially your entire adult life, and now you expect to continue living off his money even though he's gone. The cruelty of those words took my breath away. I gave up my teaching career to raise you, Marcus. Your father and I made that decision together because we wanted me to be home with you to make sure you had everything you needed. That was your choice, Marcus replied coldly. Nobody forced you to stop working. You could have kept teaching and hired a babysitter like other mothers do, but you chose the easy path, the dependent path. And now you expect to be rewarded for that dependency. I could hardly believe I was hearing these words from my own son, the child I'd rocked to sleep, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose homework I'd helped with every night for years. Marcus, I sacrificed my own dreams to make sure you had everything you needed. I was at every school play, every basketball game, every parent-teacher conference. I made your lunch every day for 12 years and drove you to all your activities and helped you with college applications. And Sarah's mother did all those same things while maintaining her own career as a surgeon, Marcus shot back. She managed to be a good mother and a successful professional. She didn't use motherhood as an excuse to stop contributing to society. Each word felt like a physical blow. This wasn't grief talking or stress or temporary confusion. This was Marcus telling me exactly what he thought of the life I'd chosen, the love I'd poured into raising him. In his mind, I was worthless because I hadn't earned money. My value as a person, as his mother, as Robert's wife, meant nothing because it couldn't be measured in dollars. I want you to think seriously about selling this house. Marcus continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. The property is worth about $400,000 in today's market. We could split that money and you could buy a nice little condo somewhere. Something more appropriate for a single woman your age. You don't need all this space, and frankly, you can't afford the maintenance and taxes on your own. This is my home, Marcus. This is where we raised you, where your father and I built our life together. This house is full of memories. Memories don't pay property taxes, Mother. Be practical. Sarah has found several nice senior living communities that would be perfect for you. They have activities, meal plans, and medical care available. You'd be much better off there than rattling around in this big house by yourself. Senior living communities. He was talking about putting me in an old folks' home like I was some doddering invalid who couldn't take care of herself. I was 62, not 92. I was grieving, not senile. And if I don't want to sell the house, Marcus's expression hardened further. Then we'll have to explore legal options. Sarah has been researching precedents for cases where estate distributions don't reflect the actual contributions of family members. There are ways to challenge a will when it's clearly unfair or based on emotional manipulation rather than sound judgment. Are you threatening to sue me, Marcus? Your own mother. I'm trying to find a solution that works for everyone, Mother, but if you're going to be stubborn about this, then yes, we'll have to involve lawyers and courts. I'm not going to stand by and watch you waste Dad's legacy when I could be using those assets to build real wealth for our family's future. Our family. He said, our family, meaning himself and Sarah, not including me. I was no longer part of the family he was building wealth for. I was just an obstacle to be overcome, a problem to be solved. That night, after Marcus left with his threats and his briefcase full of legal research, I sat in Robert's chair and tried to understand how I'd failed so completely as a mother. Where had I gone wrong? How had the sweet little boy who used to crawl into my lap for bedtime stories become this cold stranger who saw me as nothing more than a financial burden? I cried until I had no tears left, and then I sat in the darkness listening to the house settle around me. This house that Marcus wanted me to sell that held every memory of our life as a family. And for the first time since Robert's funeral, I felt something other than sadness. I felt angry. I woke up the next morning with a pounding headache and puffy eyes, but also with a strange sense of determination. Maybe it was anger, or maybe it was just the stubborn streak that my mother always said would either save me or get me in trouble. Either way, I knew I needed to take care of one final task related to Robert's funeral arrangements. I needed to pick up Robert's personal effects from the funeral home, his wedding ring, his wallet, his keys, and a few other items that had been with him when he died. Mr. Johnson at Heritage Funeral Home had mentioned they would hold everything for a few days, but I knew I needed to collect those last pieces of my husband's life before I could truly begin to heal. I drove to Heritage Funeral Home in Robert's blue Toyota Camry, the car he'd driven to work every day for the past 8 years. The car Marcus had been eyeing yesterday when he made his comments about asset distribution. Everything I owned, everything Robert and I had built together was apparently up for evaluation in Marcus's grand plan to redistribute our life according to his wife's legal advice. When I pulled into the funeral home parking lot, I was surprised to see Marcus's rental car already there. Through the window, I could see him inside the main office, gesturing animatedly while talking to Mr. Johnson. My stomach clenched with anxiety. What was Marcus doing here? And why hadn't he told me he was coming? I walked through the funeral home's heavy wooden doors past the chapel where we'd said goodbye to Robert just 2 days ago. The scent of flowers and carpet cleaner still lingered in the air, bringing back the surreal haze of the funeral. As I approached the main office, I could hear Marcus's voice, sharp and authoritative. Like I explained to you, Mr. Johnson, I'm handling all the final arrangements for my father's estate. My mother is elderly and not in the right emotional state to make important decisions right now. I'll be taking care of all remaining business matters. Elderly, I was 62, the same age as several of Marcus's professional colleagues, but apparently in his mind, being a widow automatically made me incompetent to handle basic tasks. Mr. Johnson, a kindly man in his 70s who had run Heritage Funeral Home for over 40 years, looked uncomfortable. Well, Mr. Daniels, I appreciate your concern for your mother, but Mrs. Daniels is listed as the primary contact for all arrangements. I really should speak with her directly about— Mr. Johnson, Marcus interrupted, his voice taking on the condescending tone I remembered from his teenage years when he thought he knew better than everyone around him. I understand your policy, but you need to understand the reality of this situation. My mother has never handled financial or legal matters. My father took care of everything during their marriage. She doesn't understand the implications of estate transfers, tax responsibilities, or asset management. That's when Mr. Johnson noticed me standing in the doorway. Oh, Mrs. Daniels, I'm so glad you're here. We were just discussing. I heard what you were discussing, I said quietly, stepping into the office. Hello, Marcus. I didn't know you were planning to come here today. Marcus turned around, and for just a moment I saw something flicker across his face. Embarrassment maybe, or annoyance at being caught, but it quickly disappeared, replaced by that cold, businesslike expression he'd worn since arriving for the funeral. Mother, I was just trying to help you with these final details. Mr. Johnson and I were working out the remaining arrangements. What remaining arrangements? I asked. I thought everything was settled. Mr. Johnson cleared his throat nervously. Mrs. Daniels, your son was asking about transferring the final paperwork and your husband's personal effects to his name. He said he would be handling all estate matters going forward. The room went silent except for the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner. I looked at Marcus, waiting for him to explain, to tell me this was some kind of misunderstanding. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and looked me directly in the eye. Mother, we talked about this yesterday. I'm going to be managing Dad's estate and all related matters. It's better if everything goes through me from now on. We didn't talk about that, Marcus. You talked about the house and the money, but you never said anything about taking over as if I don't exist. Let's be realistic here, Marcus said, his voice getting louder. You don't understand legal procedures, you've never handled complex paperwork, and you're clearly not thinking straight right now. Sarah and I have the expertise to manage these things properly. Sarah, Mr. Johnson looked confused. Who is Sarah? My wife. She's an attorney specializing in estate law. She's been advising us on the proper way to handle Dad's affairs. I felt something break inside my chest, like a dam giving way to a flood of hurt and rage. Marcus, your father died 3 days ago. His body is barely cold in the ground, and you're already treating me like I'm incompetent to manage my own life. This isn't personal, Mother. This is about doing what's best for everyone involved. Best for who? Best for you and Sarah, because I don't see how any of this is best for me. Marcus's composure finally cracked and his true feelings spilled out. Fine. You want the truth? Yes. This is about what's best for me. I'm not going to stand by and watch you make foolish decisions with money you don't understand and property you can't maintain. Dad worked his entire life to build something, and I'm not going to let you waste it because you're too emotional and too inexperienced to think clearly. Mr. Johnson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Perhaps I should leave you two alone to discuss this privately. No, Marcus said sharply. Mr. Johnson, I need you to understand something clearly. From this point forward, I am the primary contact for anything related to my father's arrangements or estate. My mother is not capable of making these decisions. The humiliation of being dismissed so coldly in front of a stranger in the same building where we'd just honored Robert's memory was more than I could bear. But what happened next was even worse. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. Robert's keys, his house keys, his office keys, and the keys to the Toyota I'd driven to get here. "I'll also be taking Dad's car," Marcus announced. "Mother, you'll need to find another way home today." "Marcus, that car is in both your father's and my name. You can't just take it." "Actually, I can." Sarah checked the registration. "Dad's name is listed first, which means it's part of his estate. And since I'm managing the estate now, it falls under my authority." He held out his hand expectantly, waiting for me to give him the keys to my own car. The car I'd driven to grocery stores and doctor's appointments and church services for 8 years. The car that still smelled like Robert's cologne and still had his sunglasses in the console. "Please don't do this, Marcus," I whispered, feeling tears start to blur my vision. "Don't take everything away from me at once." "I'm not taking anything away from you, Mother. I'm taking responsibility for managing assets that you're not equipped to handle. There's a difference." I looked into my son's eyes, searching for any trace of the boy I'd raised, any hint of love or compassion or even basic human decency. What I saw instead was a stranger who had calculated my worth and found me lacking. A man who saw his grieving mother as nothing more than an obstacle to his financial plans. Mr. Johnson was staring at the floor, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. This kind, grandfatherly man who had helped us through one of the worst days of our lives was now witnessing my own son strip away my dignity piece by piece. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone closing a business deal. "I'm going to handle all remaining estate matters. You're going to go home and start thinking seriously about our discussion regarding the house. Sarah and I will be back next week to finalize arrangements for selling the property and relocating you to more appropriate housing. And if I refuse," Marcus shrugged, "then we'll handle this through the courts. But I think you'll find that much more unpleasant and expensive than just cooperating now." I stood there for a long moment holding Robert's car keys in my trembling hand. Everything in me wanted to fight, to scream, to tell Marcus exactly what I thought of him and his precious Sarah. But I also knew that causing a scene in Mr. Johnson's office wouldn't change anything. It would just give Marcus more ammunition for his argument that I was too emotional and unstable to manage my own affairs. So I did something that surprised both of them. I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile or a defeated smile. It was the smile of a woman who had just realized something important about herself and about the situation she was facing. It was the smile of someone who had been underestimated for far too long. "You know what, Marcus? You're absolutely right." Marcus looked suspicious. "About what? You should handle everything. You're so much smarter than I am, so much more capable. I'm just a silly old woman who doesn't understand money or legal matters or how the real world works." I placed Robert's keys in Marcus's outstretched hand, noting how he immediately relaxed when he thought he'd won. "I'll walk home," I continued sweetly. "It's only 2 miles and the exercise will do me good. You take the car. You take care of all the paperwork. You handle everything just like you want to." Marcus pocketed the keys with obvious satisfaction. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this, Mother. You'll see this is really the best solution for everyone." "Oh, I'm sure it is," I agreed. "You always were the smartest one in our family. I'm sure you've thought of everything." And as I walked out of that funeral home, leaving my son with his briefcase full of legal research and his pockets full of my husband's keys, I was already thinking about the one thing I was absolutely certain Marcus hadn't thought of. The one thing that was going to change everything. The walk home from the funeral home took me almost an hour, and by the time I reached our street, my feet were aching and my black dress was damp with perspiration. But something about that long walk had cleared my head in a way I hadn't experienced since Robert's death. Maybe it was the physical exertion, or maybe it was the shock of finally seeing Marcus's true character without any illusions left to soften the blow. Mrs. Peterson was working in her front garden when she saw me walking up the driveway. She immediately dropped her pruning shears and hurried over, her face creased with concern. "Alma, honey, what happened? Where's your car?" "You look like you've been walking for miles." "I have been," I said simply. Marcus needed to borrow Robert's car for some estate business. I told him I could use the exercise. Mrs. Peterson studied my face with the sharp eyes of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize when a story didn't add up. Estate business that couldn't wait for you to get a ride home. I didn't answer directly. I wasn't ready to discuss what had happened at the funeral home, partly because I was still processing it myself, and partly because some humiliations are too fresh and raw to share even with trusted friends. "Would you like to come in for some coffee?" Mrs. Peterson offered. "You look like you could use some company." "Thank you, but I think I need to be alone right now. There are some things I need to figure out." Inside the house, the silence felt different than it had over the past few days. Before, it had been the heavy silence of grief of a space suddenly emptied of the person who had filled it with warmth and laughter for nearly 4 decades. Now, it felt like the silence of anticipation, like the quiet moment before a storm breaks. I went straight to Robert's study, a small room off our bedroom where he'd handled all our paperwork and finances for years. I'd rarely spent time in here, not because Robert kept me out, but because he'd always been so efficient at managing our affairs that I'd never needed to involve myself. Now, I realized that my lack of involvement had been a mistake, one that Marcus was planning to use against me. Robert's desk was exactly as he'd left it on Tuesday morning when he'd kissed me goodbye and headed off to work for the last time. His coffee mug sat on a coaster next to his computer. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay open beside his appointment calendar, and his reading glasses were folded neatly on top of a stack of client files. I'd been in here several times since his death, but always briefly, just to turn off his computer or water the small plant on his windowsill. Tonight, I sat down in his chair for the first time, trying to absorb some of his competence and clarity by occupying his space. The first thing I did was call Mr. Davidson, our family lawyer. I knew it was after business hours, but Mr. Davidson had given me his home number after Robert's death and told me to call if I needed anything at all. He answered on the third ring, his voice warm and reassuring. "Alma, how are you holding up?" "I've been better, Harold. I need to ask you something about Robert's will. Marcus seems to think there might be ways to challenge it or to have some kind of legal review of the asset distribution." There was a pause. "Has Marcus said something specific about contesting the will?" I gave Mr. Davidson a brief summary of Marcus's visit the night before, including his comments about my incompetence and his threats to involve the courts if I didn't cooperate with his plans. Mr. Davidson listened without interrupting, but I could hear him making notes. "Alma, I want to be very clear about something. Robert's will is legally sound and completely valid. Marcus has no grounds whatsoever to challenge the distribution of assets. You were Robert's spouse of 38 years, and everything he left to you is yours by right, both legally and morally. But Marcus says that because I didn't contribute financially to our marriage." "That's nonsense," Mr. Davidson interrupted firmly. "The law doesn't distinguish between financial and non-financial contributions to a marriage. Your work as a homemaker and mother has the same legal standing as Robert's work as an accountant. Any judge in the country would tell Marcus exactly that." I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. "So, he can't actually force me to sell the house or divide our savings?" "Absolutely not. Marcus can hire as many lawyers as he wants, but they'll all tell him the same thing. He has no legal basis for challenging your inheritance." After I hung up with Mr. Davidson, I felt stronger, but also sadder. It was a relief to know that Marcus's threats were empty, but it was devastating to realize that my own son had been trying to intimidate and manipulate me with lies about my legal standing. He hadn't just been callous in his assessment of my worth, he'd been deliberately deceptive. I spent the next hour going through Robert's desk more systematically, familiarizing myself with our financial situation. Robert had been meticulous in his record-keeping, and it didn't take long for me to understand that we were in much better financial shape than Marcus had implied. Our savings account held over $200,000. Our house was completely paid off, and Robert's client list had been generating steady income right up until his death. But it was in the bottom drawer of Robert's desk that I found something that changed everything. Hidden beneath a stack of old tax returns was a small fireproof lockbox that I'd never seen before. It was secured with a combination lock, and after a moment of thought, I tried Robert's birthday. The lock clicked open immediately. Inside the box were several documents I didn't recognize, including what appeared to be a revised version of Robert's will dated just 6 months ago. My hands were shaking as I unfolded the papers and began to read. The first few pages were similar to the will I'd already seen, but there were additional clauses I'd never heard Mr. Davidson mention. Specifically, there was something called a family harmony provision that I'd never seen before. And then I found the letter. It was written in Robert's careful handwriting on his personal stationery, and it was addressed to me. "My dearest Alma," it began. "If you are reading this letter, it means I am no longer with you, and I am so sorry to leave you alone to face whatever challenges may come. But I am not leaving you defenseless." My heart was pounding as I continued reading. "Over the past 2 years, I have become increasingly concerned about Marcus's attitude toward you and toward our family. I've noticed the way he dismisses your contributions, the way he allows Sarah to treat you with disrespect, and the way he seems to view our marriage as a business arrangement rather than a partnership built on love. I've tried to talk to Marcus about this to help him understand how much you sacrificed for our family and how much your love and support meant to my success. But I've come to realize that he may never understand these things, especially as long as he's under Sarah's influence. So I've taken steps to protect you just in case my fears prove justified." The letter went on to explain the additional clauses in the will provisions that would only take effect under specific circumstances. If Marcus showed disrespect, hostility, or financial pressure toward me within 6 months of Robert's death, a special clause would be triggered that would revoke Marcus's inheritance entirely. All of his portion of our savings, about $50,000, would instead be donated to the local literacy program where I used to volunteer, and to a scholarship fund for single mothers returning to college. But the most significant provision was one that would give me complete legal authority over Robert's business client list and all associated assets, worth nearly $300,000 in total. Robert had built relationships with these clients over decades, and many of them had already indicated they'd like me to recommend a new accountant to handle their affairs. That recommendation would be worth a substantial finder's fee. I've documented several instances of Marcus's disrespectful behavior. Robert's letter continued, including the conversation I overheard between him and Sarah last Christmas, where they discussed plans to convince you to sell the house and move to a retirement community so they could invest your money more aggressively. I've also kept records of the times Marcus has dismissed your phone calls or failed to visit when you needed support. I had to stop reading for a moment to wipe tears from my eyes. Robert had seen everything. He'd noticed Marcus's coldness, Sarah's manipulation, and the way I'd been slowly pushed to the margins of my own son's life. And instead of just feeling sad about it, he'd done something to protect me. The letter concluded with instructions to contact Mr. Davidson if I ever felt that the special provisions needed to be activated. All I had to do was provide documentation of Marcus's behavior, and the alternative will would immediately take effect. I hope you never need to use these protections, my love. I hope that losing me will bring Marcus to his senses and help him remember the mother who loved him unconditionally. But if that doesn't happen, I want you to know that you have choices, you have power, you are not helpless, and you are not alone. I sat in Robert's chair for a long time after finishing the letter, holding those legal documents and thinking about the man I'd been married to for 38 years. Even facing his own mortality, even knowing his time might be limited, Robert had been thinking about my future and my security. He'd seen problems I was too trusting to recognize, and he'd quietly, efficiently made sure I would have a way to defend myself. And tomorrow, I was going to give Marcus one last chance to remember who his mother was and what our family used to mean to him. But if he couldn't find that memory, if he insisted on treating me like a burden to be managed rather than a person to be loved, then he was going to learn something about consequences that apparently Sarah's legal research had missed. I called Marcus at his hotel the next morning and asked him to meet me at Mr. Davidson's office at 2 o'clock. I told him I wanted to discuss the estate matters with proper legal representation present, which seemed to please him. I could hear the satisfaction in his voice when he agreed to the meeting. "I'm glad you're being sensible about this, Mother. Sarah and I have prepared some paperwork that will make the transition much smoother for everyone." Of course they had. I spent the morning getting ready with more care than I'd taken with my appearance since Robert's funeral. I chose my best blue dress, the one Robert always said brought out my eyes, and I styled my hair the way I used to when I was still teaching. I wanted to look composed and dignified for what I knew would be a very important conversation. Mr. Davidson's office was in a restored Victorian house downtown filled with law books and comfortable leather furniture that suggested competence and trustworthiness. When I arrived, Mr. Davidson was waiting with a warm hug and a cup of coffee. "How are you feeling about this meeting, Alma?" "Nervous," I admitted, "but also ready. I've been underestimated for too long." Marcus and Sarah arrived precisely on time, both dressed in expensive suits and carrying matching leather briefcases. Sarah looked around Mr. Davidson's office with the slight disdain she seemed to reserve for anything that wasn't sleek and modern. Marcus greeted me with a perfunctory hug and shook hands with Mr. Davidson as if they were meeting for the first time, even though Harold had been our family lawyer for over 15 years. "Mr. Davidson, I appreciate you taking time to meet with us today," Marcus began in his most professional tone. "My wife and I have prepared some proposals for restructuring my father's estate in a way that will be more beneficial for all parties involved." Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents. "We've researched several options for maximizing the return on Mr. Daniels's assets while providing appropriate care and housing for Mrs. Daniels during her remaining years." Remaining years, as if I was on my deathbed instead of being a healthy 62-year-old woman. "Before we look at your proposals," Mr. Davidson said calmly, "I'd like to review the current will with everyone present just to make sure we're all working from the same understanding of Robert's wishes." He pulled out a copy of Robert's original will and began reading the key provisions aloud. Marcus and Sarah exchanged glances as Harold explained that the majority of assets had been left to me with a smaller inheritance designated for Marcus. "Now, as you can see," Marcus interrupted, "this distribution doesn't reflect the economic realities of our family situation. My mother has no experience managing significant assets, while I have extensive training in financial planning and investment strategies." "I understand your concern," Mr. Davidson replied. "But Robert was quite specific about his reasoning for this distribution. He felt that Alma's contributions to the family had been substantial and that she deserved security in her later years." "Contributions?" Sarah spoke up for the first time. "What contributions? She hasn't worked outside the home in over 30 years. She has no professional skills, no business experience, and no understanding of complex financial matters." I felt the familiar sting of being dismissed, but this time it was cushioned by the knowledge that I wasn't as powerless as they assumed. I said nothing, just waited to see how far they would push. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, "we're concerned about Mrs. Daniels' ability to maintain the family home and manage her affairs as she ages. Our proposal would place the estate assets in a trust managed by Marcus, with provisions for Mrs. Daniels' care in an appropriate senior living facility." "You want to put my client in a nursing home?" Mr. Davidson asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Not a nursing home," Marcus corrected quickly. "A high-quality retirement community, somewhere she can have activities and social interaction without the burden of maintaining a large house." "I see, and Mrs. Daniels has agreed to this plan." All three of them looked at me expectantly. Marcus and Sarah clearly assumed I would go along with their proposal, especially since they'd made it clear that opposition would result in legal challenges I supposedly couldn't afford to fight. "Actually," I said quietly, "I'd like to discuss something else first." Marcus frowned. "Mother, we've already been through all this. I thought you understood that cooperation would be easier for everyone." "Oh, I do understand that, sweetheart. I understand a lot of things now that I didn't understand before." I turned to Mr. Davidson. "Harold, would you please explain to Marcus and Sarah about the additional provisions in Robert's will? The ones that take effect under certain circumstances." The look of confusion on Marcus's face was almost comical. "Additional provisions? What additional provisions?" Mr. Davidson opened a second folder and pulled out the documents I'd brought him that morning. "Well, Marcus, it seems your father anticipated that there might be some family discord after his death, so he included what we call a conduct clause in his will." "A what?" Sarah's voice was sharp with suspicion. "A conduct clause. It's not uncommon in estates where there's concern about how beneficiaries might treat surviving spouses. Essentially, it states that if Marcus demonstrates disrespect, hostility, or attempts to pressure Mrs. Daniels regarding her inheritance within 6 months of Mr. Daniels's death, Marcus's portion of the inheritance will be revoked and redistributed." The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus looked like he'd been hit by a truck, and Sarah's face was rapidly turning red. "That's impossible," Sarah finally sputtered. "We reviewed the will carefully. There was nothing about any conduct clause." "You reviewed the basic will," Mr. Davidson corrected. "But Robert filed an updated version 6 months ago with additional provisions that would only be disclosed if they became relevant." Marcus found his voice. "You can't be serious. Dad wouldn't do something like that." "I'm afraid he was quite serious," Mr. Davidson replied, pulling out photocopies of the documentation Robert had compiled. He was particularly concerned about some conversations he'd overheard, including one last Christmas where you and Sarah discussed plans to pressure your mother into selling her home. Sarah's professional composure finally cracked. "This is ridiculous. We were just trying to help her make practical decisions." According to Robert's notes, the exact quote was that you plan to convince the old lady to liquidate her assets so we can invest the money properly instead of letting it sit there earning nothing. I watched Marcus's face as Mr. Davidson read his father's documentation. The arrogance and certainty he'd displayed over the past few days was rapidly dissolving into panic. "But I'm his son," Marcus said weakly. "He wouldn't cut me out of his will completely." "He didn't want to," I said softly. "Robert loved you, Marcus, but he also loved me, and he wasn't going to let anyone, even you, spend my remaining years making me feel worthless and unwanted." Marcus turned to look at me fully for the first time since arriving. "Mother, please, if there's been a misunderstanding." "There hasn't been a misunderstanding, sweetheart. You've made your feelings about me very clear. Yesterday at the funeral home, you told Mr. Johnson that I was incompetent to handle my own affairs. You took Robert's car keys and told me to find my own way home. You've threatened to sue me if I don't sell my house and move to a retirement home. And just now your wife explained to everyone in this room that I've made no contributions to my own family." "Those aren't the only documented incidents," Mr. Davidson added, consulting Robert's notes. "There's also the time you hung up on your mother when she called to tell you about Robert's first heart episode because you said you were too busy for family drama." Marcus's face was pale now. Dad was keeping notes about our conversations. "Your father was a thorough man, Marcus. When he became concerned about something, he documented it carefully." Mr. Davidson closed the folder. "The conduct clause has been activated. Your inheritance will be donated to charity as specified in the revised will." The room was silent except for the ticking of an old clock on Harold's mantel. Marcus and Sarah sat frozen, apparently unable to process what they'd just learned. Finally, Sarah found her voice. "We'll contest this. That conduct clause can't possibly be legal." "Actually, it's completely legal and quite enforceable," Mr. Davidson replied calmly. "I should know since I helped Robert draft it. Courts generally support provisions that protect surviving spouses from family pressure and financial abuse." "This is insane," Marcus said, his voice rising. "You can't punish me for trying to help my mother make smart financial decisions." "I'm not punishing you for anything, Marcus," I said quietly. "I'm just accepting your assessment of our relationship. You said I wasn't your family anymore. You said I didn't deserve Robert's legacy because I hadn't contributed anything of value. Well, if that's how you really feel, then you're right. You shouldn't inherit anything from people you consider worthless." Marcus stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. Maybe he was. Maybe for the first time in years he was actually looking at his mother instead of just seeing an obstacle to his financial planning. "But, Mom," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on that word. "I'm still your son." "Yes," I agreed. "You are still my son, and I will always love you, Marcus. But love doesn't mean I have to accept being treated with disrespect and cruelty. Your father understood that. He loved you enough to give you every opportunity to be a good son, but he loved me enough to make sure I had protection if you chose not to be. And for the first time since Robert's death, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt proud of myself. 6 months have passed since that meeting in Mr. Davidson's office, and my life has taken on a rhythm and richness that I never could have imagined during those dark days right after Robert's funeral. The house that Marcus wanted me to sell has become more truly mine than it ever was before. I've redecorated the living room, planted a larger garden than I've had in years, and converted Robert's study into a reading nook where I spend hours with books I never had time for when I was focused entirely on taking care of everyone else. Marcus tried to call me several times in the weeks after our meeting with Mr. Davidson. At first, his messages were angry and accusatory. He insisted that I was being manipulated by lawyers who wanted to profit from family discord. He threatened to challenge the conduct clause despite Sarah's grudging admission that it was legally sound. He even suggested that Robert must have been suffering from dementia when he updated his will, though medical records quickly disproved that theory. But as time went on, Marcus's calls became less frequent and his tone became more uncertain. The last message he left was 3 weeks ago, and instead of threats or accusations, it was a simple statement. "Mom, I've been thinking about some things and I'd like to talk to you when you're ready." I haven't called him back yet, not because I don't love him, but because I've learned something important about the difference between loving someone and allowing them to mistreat you. Robert's final gift to me wasn't just financial security, it was the reminder that I have value, that my life and my feelings matter, and that I don't have to accept cruelty from anyone, even from my own son. I've used my newfound confidence to reconnect with parts of myself that I'd set aside during all those years of trying to earn Marcus's affection. I started volunteering again at the literacy center where I used to work before Marcus was born. Teaching adults to read has reminded me that I do have skills that I can contribute something valuable to the world beyond cooking dinner and doing laundry. The scholarship fund that received Marcus's inheritance has already helped 3 single mothers enroll in college programs that will let them build better lives for their families. Every time I get an update about their progress, I think about Robert and how proud he would be to know that his money is being used to give other women the opportunities I never had to pursue my own education and career. I've also discovered that I'm much better at managing finances than Marcus assumed. Working with Mr. Davidson and our accountant, I've learned to understand investments, tax planning, and estate management. It turns out that the same careful attention to detail that made me a good teacher and homemaker also makes me quite capable of handling complex financial decisions. Who knew? Last month I did something that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. I bought a car. Not a practical, economical car like the Toyota that Marcus took from me at the funeral home. I bought a red Honda CR-V with all-wheel drive and a sunroof. When the salesman asked if I needed to consult with my son about such a major purchase, I just smiled and told him that I was quite capable of making my own decisions. Mrs. Peterson has become more than just a neighbor. She's become one of my closest friends. We take turns cooking dinner for each other, and she's helped me discover a talent for watercolor painting that I never knew I had. She was the one who encouraged me to join a grief support group where I've met other women who've faced similar challenges with adult children who see their aging parents as burdens rather than people worthy of respect. Dorothy, the woman I mentioned earlier, has become especially important in my life. She lost her husband 2 years ago and went through a similar experience with her daughter who tried to pressure her into selling her home and moving in with relatives. Dorothy's strength and wisdom have helped me understand that what happened with Marcus wasn't a reflection of my worth as a mother, but rather a symptom of a culture that often devalues older women and sees them as problems to be managed rather than people with their own dreams and autonomy. The most surprising development has been my relationship with Pastor Williams. After Robert's death, he began stopping by regularly to check on me, and our conversations gradually evolved from pastoral care into genuine friendship. Last week, he asked if I'd be interested in helping him develop a program for widows and widowers in our congregation. The idea that my experience could help other people navigate similar challenges feels like a way to honor both Robert's memory and the lessons I've learned about my own strength. I think about Marcus every day, and I pray that someday he'll understand that what happened between us wasn't about money or legal documents. It was about dignity, respect, and the right of every person to be treated with basic human kindness, regardless of their age, gender, or economic productivity. 2 weeks ago, I received a letter from Sarah. Not from Marcus, but from Sarah herself. It was a brief, formal note stating that she and Marcus were divorcing. She didn't provide details, and I don't know if their marriage ended because of financial pressure, the stress of legal challenges, or simply because they discovered that a relationship built on shared arrogance isn't strong enough to weather real adversity. I felt sad when I read Sarah's letter, not because I had any affection for her, but because I realized that Marcus was going through another major life change without any family support. Then I reminded myself that family support requires family respect and that Marcus would need to understand that basic principle before we could rebuild any kind of meaningful relationship. But here's what I've learned over these past 6 months. Healing doesn't require reconciliation with the people who hurt you. It requires reconciliation with yourself, with your own worth and dignity and right to be treated well. I spent 35 years trying to earn my son's love by making myself smaller, by accepting less respect and consideration than I deserved. I thought that if I just loved him enough, sacrificed enough, gave enough, he would eventually see my value. What I understand now is that you can't make someone value you by devaluing yourself. You can't earn respect by accepting disrespect, and you can't build a healthy relationship with someone who sees you as fundamentally less important than they are. The money that Marcus lost, the inheritance he forfeited, wasn't really about money at all. It was about consequences. It was about the reality that our choices, especially our choices about how we treat other people, have results that we may not anticipate or like. Robert knew that I would need more than just financial security to protect myself from a son who had learned to see me as disposable. He knew I would need to remember my own strength, my own worth, my own right to demand respect. The conduct clause wasn't just about punishing bad behavior. It was about empowering me to stand up for myself when I might otherwise have accepted unacceptable treatment just to maintain family peace. And you know what? Yesterday Marcus called again. But this time was different. This time he didn't ask about money or legal matters or practical arrangements. This time he asked about my health. He asked if I was doing okay living alone, if I needed help with anything around the house, if I was feeling lonely. I told him I was doing better than I had in years. I told him about my volunteering, my painting classes, my new friendships, and my plans to take a trip to Italy next spring, something Robert and I had always talked about doing, but never quite managed to arrange. There was a long pause after I finished talking, and then Marcus said something I never expected to hear. "Mom, I think I understand now why Dad set up that clause in his will, and I think I'm starting to understand how I've been treating you all these years." I didn't respond immediately because I wanted to be very careful about what I said next. I've learned that apologies are easy, but changed behavior is what really matters. "I'm glad you're thinking about these things, Marcus," I finally said. "Take your time with those thoughts. When you're ready to talk about building a different kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than your assessment of my usefulness, I'll be here." "I love you, Mom," he said, and for the first time in years it sounded like he meant it. "I love you too, sweetheart. I always have, and I always will. But I've learned that love isn't enough by itself. Love needs to be accompanied by kindness, respect, and consideration for other people's dignity." We'll see what happens next. Maybe Marcus really has learned something from these past 6 months. Maybe losing his inheritance and his marriage has helped him understand that relationships can't be built on taking advantage of other people's love and generosity. Maybe he's ready to see his mother as a whole person, rather than just a supporting character in his own story. Or maybe he hasn't really changed, and this is just another strategy for getting what he wants. Time will tell. But here's what I know for certain. I don't need Marcus to change in order for me to be happy. I don't need his approval or his affection or his respect in order to have a meaningful, fulfilling life. Those things would be wonderful gifts if he's capable of giving them genuinely, but they're not requirements for my own well-being. I've learned to love myself enough to set boundaries, to demand respect, and to walk away from relationships that diminish rather than enhance my life. I've learned that it's possible to love someone deeply while still protecting yourself from their capacity to hurt you. And I've learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to refuse to enable their worst impulses, even when that refusal comes with painful consequences for both of you. Robert always said I was stronger than I knew. These past 6 months have proven him right. I just wish he could be here to see the woman I've become, the woman I always had the potential to be once I stopped trying so hard to make everyone else happy and started focusing on treating myself with the same kindness I'd always shown to others. If you're watching this and you're dealing with family members who treat you as if your feelings don't matter, as if your contributions aren't valuable, as if your needs are less important than theirs, I want you to know something: you deserve better. You deserve to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of your age, your income, your gender, or your role in the family. Love doesn't require you to accept mistreatment. Loyalty doesn't require you to enable harmful behavior. Family relationships, like all relationships, need to be built on a foundation of mutual respect and consideration. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in your own diminishment. What do you think? Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members who took your love for granted? Have you found the strength to demand respect from people who assumed you'd accept whatever treatment they chose to give you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in life's most challenging moments. Share this with anyone who might need to hear that they deserve to be treated with dignity, no matter what their circumstances. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to see it. You matter. Your feelings matter, and your right to respect matters, even when the people who should love you most seem to have forgotten that truth. Take care of yourselves, and remember that sometimes the greatest act of love is learning to love yourself enough to walk away from people who can't see your value.